The town was the kind of place you wouldn't find on any modern map. It had once flourished in the golden era of rail and river trade, but when the steel arteries of highways and new cities bypassed it, the town slowly folded in on itself like old paper. Now, fog curled through its narrow cobblestone alleys each morning like a memory it refused to let go of. Ivy wrapped the iron lamps. The smell of moss and forgotten rain clung to the walls of shuttered windows. There was a particular alley, thin as a whisper, that curved behind the old bookbindery and ended in a blind corner. Few people ever walked it, and fewer still remembered what stood there. Locals spoke of it vaguely, like recalling a dream that slips through your fingers just as you try to retell it. Some said there had once been a watchmaker there. Others insisted it was a toy maker. But no one ever gave a name. At the far end of the alley stood a building that looked older than the rest, though it had aged in a different way. Its wooden beams were almost black, as if soaked in shadows. A faded sign hung from rusted hooks. Calder's Timepieces Repairs. The letters had bled and curled with time, now barely legible under the grime of decades. The windows were clouded with dust and speckled with cobwebs that danced ever so slightly in the cold breeze, even when no one walked by. But it wasn't abandoned. Not entirely. Behind the windows, shapes moved in the gloom. Slow, deliberate, quiet. Some claimed to hear faint chimes when they passed, though there were no bells. And sometimes, just beneath the rustle of leaves or the distant groan of an old trolley wire, a soft ticking could be heard. Too quiet to locate, too rhythmic to ignore. Strangers never noticed the shop. It wasn't listed in any guidebook or business registry. No ads. No phone number. If someone asked a local how to get there, the reply was usually a squint or a shrug. That old place? I thought it shut down before the war. And yet, when the wind came from the south and the clouds sat low over the chimney tops, the smell of oiled brass and time-worn would seem to leak out of the alley's mouth, beckoning. The shop had become part of the town's silence. Something always there but never quite seen. A blind spot in the mind. A leftover stitch in the fabric of reality. And up above it, hidden in the folds of the slanted slate roof, there was an attic. Its small round window faced the street like a closed eye, watching without blinking. No light ever flickered there. No shadow passed. The townsfolk didn't speak of it because, in a way, they didn't remember it. The attic belonged to someone else. Something else. And it was waiting. The door to Calder's Timepieces opened with a groan that felt too long, as though it hadn't been used in decades. Even though the floors inside were swept, the shelves were neatly kept, and there was no dust on the countertop. It was the kind of contradiction that made your stomach tighten without reason. The bell above the door was small, brass, perfectly polished, yet it did not ring. Not once. Inside, the air was thick with age. Not decay, not mildew, no, it was a more delicate kind of oldness. It smelled like pressed velvet, like the inside of a clock that had ticked its last hour centuries ago but still remembered how to move. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each one sagging under the weight of timepieces that had long stopped keeping time. Grandfather clocks with lion-carved pediments. Mantel clocks with mother-of-pearl inlays. Pocket watches tucked inside velvet boxes. And everywhere, the circular faces of clocks, frozen in place. Some clocks had their hands pointing toward moments that felt almost symbolic: 3:33, 12 o'clock, 11:59. Others were stranger: 4 hours 61 minutes, midnight, one that seemed to loop endlessly from 13 to 14. Their glass eyes stared blindly outward, as if waiting for someone to ask the right question. But none of them moved. Not a single tick. Not even the hum of battery or the winding of a spring. The silence inside the shop was not just quiet, it was absolute. A vacuum where time dared not tread. At the back of the shop sat a counter made from dark walnut, its surface polished smooth by years of absent use. Behind it, shelves were lined with drawers, thin ones, like library card catalogs, each with a brass label holder that was either blank or smeared illegibly. A heavy magnifying lens was mounted on an articulated arm. A few tools were scattered nearby. Tiny screwdrivers, a jeweler's loop, a dish of loose gears and springs. But no fingerprints. No fresh markings. The shop was clean, yes, but untouched. Oddest of all were the mirrors. 4 of them. Not placed for decoration, but for angles, each tilted slightly downward, capturing reflections from corners that shouldn't matter. If you stood still, you could see yourself reflected from several odd positions at once. But sometimes, just for a moment, your reflection wouldn't move when you did. And yet, the room didn't feel malevolent. It wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. There were no bloodstains or creaking footsteps, no icy breath on the back of the neck. Instead, it felt like something was watching, politely, not hiding, just waiting. There was a patience in the room, the kind that stretched beyond human scale, a patience that belonged to machines made to count centuries. In the center of the shop, mounted on a carved stand, stood the largest clock of all. It had no hands, just a white porcelain face with faint markings that were impossible to read unless you squinted. And even then, they seemed to rearrange themselves when you looked away. A heavy chain wound down from the center of the clock's body and disappeared beneath a hatch in the floor. The hatch was bolted shut, not locked, bolted, with black iron rivets that looked like they'd been melted into place. There was no keyhole, no handle, and no reason given. At the edge of the counter, a small wooden sign hung by a piece of twine. Its message was etched in elegant cursive. Time is not broken. It simply waits. The floorboards groaned ever so slightly, not with footsteps, but like the breath of a house too old to die. Somewhere above, in the ceiling that sloped into shadows, a faint creak echoed. No footsteps, just a shift in weight, presence. Upstairs, in the attic, waiting, the man who arrived in town that autumn had no reason to stay long. His name was Elias Hart. He was a quiet figure, the sort that drifts unnoticed through small towns without drawing suspicion or interest. His coat was plain, his suitcase battered, his boots worn soft by miles of walking. He spoke little, smiled when appropriate, and paid in cash. To the innkeeper, he said he was a writer looking for a place with quiet. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with thick glasses and stiff hands, nodded knowingly. Writers were always passing through, some looking for stories, others trying to escape them. Elias had come farther than most. He had spent years drifting from place to place, chasing rumors, whispers, and half-forgotten names that danced on the edge of myth. He was not just a writer. He was a collector of oddities, not things but histories. He hunted down the kinds of stories that didn't make it into books. Old folk legends, vanishing villages, places where reality had worn thin and let other things peek through. It was in a yellow journal, buried deep within an estate sale in Prague, that Elias had first read about Calder's timepieces. A passing mention, just a single line, scribbled in the margin by a man who later disappeared. A shop where time is stored like coins in a drawer. Not sold, not fixed, just kept. That was enough for Elias. When he arrived in the town, he was struck not by how it looked, but how it felt. As though the air itself had been paused mid-sentence. The trees rustled without breeze. The shadows fell at odd angles, slightly too long or too short. The church bell in the square hadn't rung in years, and no one seemed to mind. Everyone was polite, helpful, but distant, like actors who knew their lines but not their characters. Elias found the alley on his 3rd day, though he couldn't recall deciding to walk down it. One moment he was turning a corner near the abandoned trolley tracks, and the next he was standing in front of the shop. Calder's timepieces. He stared at the sign, the building's soot-dark facade, the clouded windows. Something about it tugged at his thoughts, as if his memory were reaching forward instead of backward. The feeling was familiar, but from a dream, not a memory. The door opened easily, though he hadn't touched it. The bell did not ring. Inside, time stopped. Literally. His wristwatch halted. The digital clock on his phone froze. The hands of every clock in the shop remained still, and yet the air was not dead. It breathed. Elias wandered slowly, reverently, as though walking through a cathedral. He felt no fear, only the unsettling calm of being seen. Not watched, seen. As if the shop already knew him, had been waiting for him, and was pleased he had finally arrived. He stood for a long time before the clock with no hands. Its face stared back at him, blank but heavy with intention. Something about the chain that disappeared into the bolted floor made his skin crawl, but he did not look away. It was like standing at the edge of a well with no bottom, listening for the echo of your own heartbeat. He did not remember deciding to ask the innkeeper about the apartment above the shop. But that night, over a bowl of soup, the words left his mouth as if spoken by someone else. "Does anyone rent the attic above Calder's timepieces?" The woman paused. Her ladle stopped mid-stir. Her eyes, normally clouded with the softness of age, sharpened. "That place," she said slowly, "didn't think anyone lived there anymore. So it's empty?" "Not empty," she said after a pause. "Just quiet." He offered a generous sum. She hesitated only briefly before giving him the key. A thin iron thing that looked too old to still fit any lock. The next day, Elias moved in. The attic door creaked open like a reluctant mouth. Dust swirled in the golden slats of afternoon light, painting the air in webs of memory. The room was bare, just a small iron-framed bed, a desk with claw feet, and a single round window that faced the town like a blind eye. But the moment Elias stepped inside, he felt it. The weight, the tick beneath the floorboards. Soft, steady, waiting. The attic room above Calder's timepieces was not remarkable in any way, not to the eye. It was a single large space, the walls sloped with the roof's descent, giving it a triangular feel. The floorboards were rough, dark, and creaked beneath every step, but not in protest, more like in conversation. The light from the round window was dim even during the day, as though the glass itself filtered out time. The bed was small, iron-framed, with a lumpy mattress and sheets that bore the faint scent of lavender and old paper. The desk was tucked into the corner, its drawers stuck from age, its surface grooved with decades of scratches and ink stains. But it was the floor that Elias returned to every time, not just with his eyes, but with his ears, his skin, his instincts. On the first night, the sound came just past midnight. It was subtle, like the brushing of fabric across wood. A gentle shift, not quite footsteps, but movement nonetheless. Elias, half asleep, sat up in bed. The air felt colder, though the window was shut tight. He held his breath. Silence. Then it came again. A whisper, soft as silk, right beneath the floorboards. Not words, not yet, just the faintest murmur, like someone sighing into the grain of the wood. He got out of bed slowly. Each step toward the center of the room felt heavier, as though the floor wanted to pull him closer. He knelt, pressed his ear to the boards, waited. Nothing. But just as he began to pull away, there it was, a distant tick. Then another. A metronome rhythm, slow and deliberate, buried deep within the structure of the house. It didn't sound like a clock. It sounded alive. And beneath the tick, the whisper returned. Still not words, just the sound of presence. As if someone were standing beneath him, not pacing, not crying out. Simply being. Listening back. Over the next few days, Elias tested everything. He placed a glass of water on the floor to detect vibrations. It trembled. He left a recorder running overnight. The tape captured hours of silence, interrupted only once by a low, breath-like sound, followed by a single knock. Not from a wall, from beneath. He tried speaking aloud. "Who are you?" No reply. "What do you want?" Silence. But then, just before dawn, he heard it again. Clearer now. "You," one word. Soft as moth wings. Drawn out. As though the voice hadn't spoken in years and was savoring the syllables. "You came." He sat bolt upright, his mouth dry. The air felt too still, too thick. Yet again, no fear came, just the steady pulse of knowing he had passed a threshold. He was no longer a guest here. The house had begun to respond. Each night, the voice grew a little clearer, the whispers a little longer. Elias stopped sleeping. He would lie in bed, lights out, staring at the ceiling, listening. The whispers never rose in volume, but they deepened in texture, like a choir trapped under the floor, sometimes pleading, sometimes laughing, Once, he could have sworn he heard a child humming. The attic began to change. The corners darkened. The beams of moonlight that once came through the round window stopped shifting. Time moved strangely. At dawn, his watch still showed 3:09 a.m. Meals rotted slowly. Candles burned forever. But the ticks from below grew stronger. He found himself muttering phrases in his notebook without knowing what they meant. Let it unwind. She still speaks when the chains are loose. Time listens more than it tells. He dreamt of gears the size of rooms, of winding staircases descending into brass caverns, of thousands of clocks ticking out of sync, forming a symphony of chaos. Always, in those dreams, someone stood beside him. A woman, pale hands, no eyes, whispering, but he could never wake up at will. The dreams ended when she let them. One night, he discovered the trapdoor. Not in the attic, but in his dream. A door beneath the rug, bolted, locked, sealed. And in his dream, it whispered to him, one key, one turn. That's all. He woke in sweat, pulled up the rug, and there, impossibly, was a small seam in the floorboards. One he knew hadn't been there before. Elias no longer knew the shape of his sleep. The hours stretched like molasses, sticky and vague, collapsing into one another without warning. He would close his eyes to the sound of the attic's silence, and open them to find the candle on his desk melted down to a stub, or sometimes completely untouched, as if no time had passed at all. Yet his beard grew thicker, his nails longer, his heartbeat slower. It was as though the rules of time obeyed the room's mood, not the laws of nature. The dreams were no longer occasional. They arrived each night without fail, dense and immersive, looping like broken reels of film. And within each dream, the ticking grew louder. It wasn't a single tick, not anymore. It was layers. Some slow, others frantic. 1,000 pocket watches opening and closing, gears grinding in dusty bellies, pendulums swinging from invisible rafters. The sound wasn't just heard. It was felt, as though the clocks were inside Elias now, keeping their own rhythms against the beat of his blood. The shop below had changed too, subtly at first. During the day, Elias explored more. He dusted off forgotten clocks, cataloged their faces, examined their frozen hands. He noticed patterns he'd overlooked before, that many of the clocks were stuck on times that matched moments in his dreams. 4:46, 2:17, 12:42. Random times, yes, but they began to repeat, always in the same sequence, as if they were guiding him towards something. And the mirrors, the 4 mirrors placed around the shop, were never quite where he remembered them. They rotated slightly, tilted toward new angles. Sometimes when he passed by, he would catch not himself, but a flicker of a woman's silhouette, slender, unmoving. Her face was never visible, but her posture was patient, expectant. One night, Elias dreamed of a room beneath the shop, a domed chamber of black iron walls, filled with towering clock mechanisms that moved without sound. In the center of the chamber stood the great clock from the front of the shop, but now it ticked. Its handless face spun like a compass, and its pendulum was a chain, descending into a pit so deep it vanished in darkness. He walked closer, barefoot, and the ticks grew slower, deeper, until each one felt like a tremor in the floor. Then came the voice. Not the whispering woman, but a deeper one, older, male, rusted. Time is a wound, and every wound must fester before it can heal. Elias turned, but there was no one. You've opened the listening floor. Now you must open the mouth. He awoke gasping, the room ice cold. The seam in the floorboard now had a small iron ring embedded in it, one that hadn't been there the night before. He reached out to touch it. The floor pulsed, not in sound, in heartbeat. He jerked his hand back, but he knew whatever was beneath the attic wasn't just dreaming with him. It was dreaming through him. The next day, he tried to leave the shop, just to breathe fresh air, just to stand beneath the sky. But the door was locked. No, not locked. Gone. Where the entrance had once been was now a wall of clocks. Seamless, silent. He turned back, and every clock ticked once in unison. Then silence again. And somewhere, faint and tender, from beneath the attic floor, the voice whispered, "You're right on time." Elias sat at the desk, the candlelight flickering low, his hands trembling above a velvet cloth. Spread before him was an old pocket watch he hadn't noticed before, one unlike any in the shop's inventory. It had appeared that morning on his nightstand, its silver casing tarnished and faintly warm to the touch, as if it had just been held by someone who had only recently let go. He hadn't wound it. He hadn't opened it. And yet it ticked, not with the familiar rhythm of time, but with the steady pulse of a second heart. Each tick seemed to echo a fraction behind his own heartbeat, like a delayed reflection, as if the watch were watching him in return. The front bore no brand, no initials, no symbols, just a shallow engraving of a spiral, etched into the metal so delicately it almost shimmered when the light hit it at the right angle. But when Elias finally dared to open the casing, the face revealed a single hand. Not an hour hand, not a minute hand, just one. It pointed not to a number, but to a shifting ink-like swirl beneath the glass, almost liquid in motion, always changing direction, never repeating. As he held the watch closer to his ear, the ticking grew louder. And beneath it, just faintly, he could hear something more. Breathing. At first, he thought it was his own. But the rhythm was off. The breaths were shallow, wet, like lungs filled with dust. They rasped in time with the watch's movement, as though something inside was asleep or pretending to be. Then it whispered, "Don't close me." He dropped the watch onto the desk and stumbled back. It didn't break. It didn't even stop ticking. The whisper was gone. But the sensation remained, like being watched from inside a mirror, like something had peered out from the gears and seen too much. That evening, Elias set the watch on the desk and tried to ignore it, but every time he turned his head, he could feel it following him, the hand ever pointing toward the edge of the glass, the liquid swirl twisting hypnotically behind it. Eventually, curiosity overtook him. He picked it up once more. "Why me?" he asked aloud. The ticking slowed, then stopped. He stared at the unmoving hand, heart pounding. And then, slowly, impossibly, the glass fogged from inside. A breath, not his own. And in the condensation that formed, a message began to appear, written as though by an unseen fingertip. "You listen. That's enough." He felt a sudden weight in his chest, a pressure like dread, but also like recognition, as if something had been waiting centuries just for a single question. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat with the watch cradled in his palm, candle burning low, waiting for it to move again. At midnight, it began ticking once more, but this time in perfect synchrony with his own heart. From beneath the floor, the whispering resumed, not in voices now, but in the sound of countless clocks winding themselves. Chains sliding, mechanisms clicking into place. The attic room pulsed in silence, and the watch in his hand, cold and alive, ticked 3 final times. Tick, tick, welcome. It was during the darkest hour before dawn that Elias first saw her. Not in a dream, not in a vision, but fully, plainly, terrifyingly awake. The attic had been unusually quiet that night, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The clocks below had ceased their endless ticking. The watch on his desk stood still, its lone hand pointing downward, frozen like a compass magnetized to something buried. And the whispering, the voice that had accompanied him for nights on end, had stopped. In its place, there was a weight, a heavy stillness in the air, like the moment just before thunder cracks the sky. Then came the first sound, a slow, steady thud from beneath the floorboards. Thud, thud. It wasn't knocking. It wasn't scratching. It was deliberate, like footsteps, bare feet on ancient wood, pacing slowly back and forth beneath the room. Not random, not searching, waiting. Elias backed away from the floor's center, candle trembling in his hand. The room was dim, the shadows deep, and the iron ring embedded in the floor now gleamed faintly with condensation, like cold metal exposed to breath. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped, and then the floor opened, silently, without groan or creak. The central board split along its seam, rising ever so slightly, as though pushed up from beneath by a finger, or perhaps a face. A hand emerged first, pale, feminine, dirt-caked under the nails. It trembled as it braced against the floor. Then another hand followed, equally thin, equally dead. Elias couldn't move, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this was what he'd been waiting for. What the shop, the clocks, the dreams had all been preparing him to witness. The figure rose slowly, gracefully, like a puppet drawn upward by invisible strings. She was not a ghost. She was real, too real. Her skin was the gray-white of pressed paper. Her dress a tattered nightgown stained by time and damp earth. Her hair hung like wet ropes across her face. But as she lifted her head, Elias finally saw her eyes. They were mirrors, not metaphorically, literally. Where her eyes should have been, two perfect glass orbs reflected the flickering candlelight and the room around her, including Elias himself. When he looked into them, he did not see fear. He saw a boy, a child version of himself, kneeling beside a grave, holding a broken watch. She stepped forward, and the floor closed behind her soundlessly. No dust, no draft, just the seamless wood, as if it had never opened. She spoke then, not aloud, but in the voice that had whispered for nights, now fully formed and echoing inside Elias's mind. You left me behind. Time never forgets. Elias staggered backward, memories crashing in like waves. A funeral, rain. His father whispering something about letting the house go. A broken attic window sealed shut. A lullaby sung in reverse. The woman stepped closer, and her reflection eyes shifted. Now they showed the shop, but long ago, in sepia tones, bustling with customers, with Elias as a boy hiding beneath the counter. And there she was again, the woman, standing at the back of the store, whispering to a man behind the great clock. A man with Elias's face, only older. She reached out and gently placed a hand on Elias's chest. Cold, feather light. It was never just a shop. It was a mouth. And you were born with the key. The attic dimmed. The candle flickered low. And behind her, one by one, the clocks on the wall began to tick again. But this time in perfect unison. She stepped back toward the center of the floor, looked once more into Elias's eyes, and then, with a whisper like silk tearing, she sank back into the floor. The wood sealed itself without a sound. Elias fell to his knees, breathless. The attic felt warmer. The pressure had lifted. But the watch on his desk was ticking faster now, too fast, as though counting down. He picked it up, and on the fogged glass inside, another message had appeared. She remembers. And then, underneath in smaller letters, scratched faintly into the metal rim, so do you. The next morning, Elias did not descend to the shop floor. He didn't win the clocks, nor brew his customary tea. He sat in the attic, the weight of the night still coiled around him like ivy. The woman, the ghost, the memory, the mirror-eyed messenger, had returned to wherever she came from, but her presence lingered like the scent of burnt paper. The floor was whole again, untouched, yet he knew beyond doubt that something lay beneath it. As dusk approached and the last pink threads of daylight receded from the attic window, Elias retrieved a crowbar from the storage closet. It had belonged to his father, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, its edge still stained with something black and long-dried. He knelt at the center of the room, where the iron ring had gleamed the night before. It was gone now, vanished. But Elias didn't need to see it, he remembered. His hands worked slowly, deliberately, as he wedged the crowbar beneath the board. The wood moaned, not loudly, but in that unmistakable way old wood complains when disturbed after decades of stillness. He pried upward, and this time, the floor did not resist. The board lifted like a lid. Beneath it, there was no insulation, no foundation stone, only a dark hole, no more than 3 feet across, plunging into nothingness. A scent wafted up, earthy, metallic, and sweetly foul. The smell of preserved decay. Elias lowered a lantern into the opening. its light catching on stone walls slick with condensation. There was a narrow spiral staircase, carved crudely from stone and dirt, winding downward into the depths of the house. It didn't belong there. The architecture was wrong. Older than the house, older than the town, older than anything Elias had ever studied or seen. He descended. Each step was a quiet betrayal of gravity, pulling him further from the world he knew. The spiral was tight, the air close and wet. The walls seemed to breathe, gently flexing inward like the ribs of a great stone beast. There were no cobwebs, no insects, just that steady, suffocating silence, and the feeling that something was growing stronger the deeper he went. Finally, the staircase ended at a low stone arch. Beyond it, a vast underground chamber, circular, carved directly into the bedrock. And in the center stood a single grandfather clock. Its frame was bone-white and smooth, like bleached driftwood. Its pendulum was not brass but obsidian, swinging soundlessly. No ticking, no chimes. Yet Elias felt its rhythm in his chest. Surrounding the clock were chairs, dozens of them, arranged in a circle. On each chair sat a figure, slumped and still. At first he thought them statues. Then he saw their faces. They were people or had once been. Mummified by time, skin paper-thin and pulled tight over bone, dressed in faded nightclothes and robes from eras long past. Each had a watch in their lap. Each watch ticked differently, and each figure had a small hole carved into their chest, precisely over the heart. Not bloody, not surgical, clean, hollowed, as though something had been taken from within. The clock began to chime, but it wasn't the sound of bells. It was the sound of breathing, dozens of voices exhaling in unison, synchronized like the rise and fall of an ancient tide. Elias stood frozen. The figures did not move, but the air began to change. From the back wall of the chamber, a seam appeared, a vertical line of darkness splitting open in the rock. From it, a slow whisper seeped through, carried on a current of breath older than language. You were not the first, but you may be the last. The clock's pendulum stilled, and then it began to tick backward. The room pulsed. Dust lifted from the floor in reverse, spiders unspun their webs, and the dead in their chairs began to inhale. Elias fled. Climbing the staircase felt like moving through molasses. The deeper the pendulum swung backward, the heavier time became. His memories stretched and flickered, moments from his childhood unspooling in his mind like film melting under heat. His mother's lullaby, his father's silent grief, the day he found the attic locked and forgot why. At last, he burst through the attic floor. The wood slammed shut behind him. The candle on the desk had burned completely down. Morning light pierced the window, though Elias knew only minutes had passed. On his desk, the pocket watch now lay open. Its hand was spinning wildly, backward, faster and faster, until it vanished in a blur of motion. Then silence. A final message etched itself on the glass. The chamber remembers. Do you? Elias hadn't meant to touch the portrait. He had passed by it countless times, never giving it a second glance. It was one of many that lined the staircase from the shop to the attic, sepia-toned, yellowed at the edges, painted in a style that had gone out of fashion more than a century ago. The figure in it was a woman in a Victorian dress, hair braided down one shoulder, eyes cast slightly to the right, as if watching something just out of frame. Her expression was placid, forgettable, but after returning from the chamber below the chamber, everything felt different. As he passed the portrait on his way downstairs, he paused. Something had changed. The woman's head was now slightly tilted, just enough to notice. Her eyes, once looking off to the right, now stared directly outward. Elias froze. The air pressed against him like wool soaked in ice water. He leaned in. Her irises were no longer smudges of brown paint. They were intricate, sharp, like they'd been added that very morning, stroke by stroke, with uncanny precision. Behind her, the background had also shifted. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker, and at the bottom corner of the frame, something new. A painted hourglass resting on a small table. It hadn't been there before. It was nearly full, the sand in the upper bulb trickling slowly downward in tiny golden grains. Elias touched the frame, expecting dust. It was warm, almost too warm. Then the hourglass in the portrait moved. Not much, just a slight tilt, like a nudge from an invisible hand. A single grain of painted sand dropped from the upper bulb to the lower one, and vanished. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked and looked again. Now the hourglass in the portrait was empty. He backed away, gripping the railing behind him, heart hammering. The woman's eyes had followed. No longer looking out, they stared directly at him. The painted mouth was curling, slowly, into the subtlest smile. Not warm, not wicked, but patient. He turned and fled down the stairs, but the hallway stretched longer than it should have. The light bulb above flickered violently, humming like a hornet. The portraits along the wall began to blur, the faces shifting as he passed, expressions warping into grimaces and stares, their eyes sinking deeper into shadow. At the bottom of the stairs, Elias stumbled and hit the floor hard. He scrambled to his feet and spun back toward the stairwell. All the portraits were gone. In their place hung identical paintings of a single object, the hourglass. Each canvas showed it in a different state. Some full, some empty, some shattered with sand bleeding into dark voids. Some showed tiny silhouettes of people trapped inside the glass. He ran to the attic, slamming the door behind him. The pocket watch on the desk ticked loudly. He opened his journal, hoping to record everything before it slipped from his mind like so many other things had. But when he flipped to the next blank page, he found it was already filled. A perfect ink drawing of the woman in the portrait, hourglass in hand, now standing beside Elias himself. Both of them drawn in miniature, holding hands. And beneath the drawing, the last grain always falls. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and from behind the attic door, just beyond the threshold, a sound began to rise. The dry, whispering hiss of sand pouring down a wooden frame. It didn't stop. Even when Elias pressed his hands over his ears, even when he screamed, the hourglass in the portrait had turned, and time was running out. The next morning, if it could even be called that, arrived with a sky as colorless as ash. The sun never quite rose, only dimmed the darkness to a sickly gray. Elias, hollow-eyed and trembling, wandered the corridor that led from the attic to the back of the shop, desperate for something, anything, that would feel real again. He passed the crooked grandfather clock, the toppled shelves of pocket watches, and finally stood before a mirror he hadn't noticed in years. It was mounted beside a dusty, unused dressing table once belonging to his mother. The mirror was old, its edges browned with oxidization, its silvered back flaking in spots like a diseased memory trying to fade away. But the surface still reflected barely. Elias saw himself, pale, disheveled, but as he leaned closer, something was wrong. His reflection blinked before he did. He stepped back in shock. The reflection stepped forward. He touched his cheek. The reflection touched its opposite cheek. Not mirrored, mimicking. He raised his hand. The image didn't move. Its eyes watched him with an eerie patience, as if waiting for something to happen, or perhaps to begin. Then came the first crack. It spiderwebbed across the glass without warning, slicing through the center of his reflection's face. Elias gasped, heart pounding. But the crack didn't shatter further, it simply grew, like a living vein, pulsing faintly, snaking outward until it met the frame. From within the mirror, his reflection smiled. And then the glass began to bleed. Not blood, but a thick, black liquid like ink or melted film. It oozed from the cracks, dribbling down the surface, yet it made no sound when it hit the wooden floor. The blackness pooled at Elias's feet but reflected nothing, as if it devoured light itself. His heart raced. He turned to run, but stopped. His reflection hadn't moved. It still stood there, still smiling, but now, someone else was standing behind it. A woman, the same woman from the attic, from beneath the floorboards. Her hands rested lightly on the shoulders of his doppelganger. Her eyes were not mirrors this time. They were clocks, ticking furiously inside her sockets, the hands spinning faster than anything natural. She leaned in and whispered something into the reflection's ear, and the glass cracked again. The mirror's surface began to convulse, vibrating with unnatural rhythm. More black veins erupted across it like tree branches growing in reverse. From deep within the ink, faces began to emerge. Not drawn, not painted, but real, pressed against the surface as if from behind an invisible wall. Mouths opened in slow, tortured screams. Hands clawed for escape. Each face was familiar. His father, his mother, and finally himself. But older, eyes sunken, mouth sewn shut with threads made of time. The dressing table drawers slid open of their own accord. Inside were dozens of objects Elias hadn't seen since childhood. A toy watch, a music box shaped like a coffin, a page torn from an old journal with only one line scrawled on it. What you see is not always who you are. Behind him, a soft creaking. He turned. The real world was cracking, too. The floorboards beneath his feet were warping, bending into spiral patterns. The ceiling above rippled like disturbed water. The very air hummed with some buried engine of madness. He looked back at the mirror. The reflection was gone. Only the woman remained. She reached out through the glass. And this time, the mirror did shatter. A deafening explosion of shards erupted outward, though none struck Elias. They hovered midair, spinning slowly around him like the hands of invisible clocks. The black pool on the floor began to bubble, and from its center rose a single, ticking watch, the same one he had buried with his father. It floated toward his hands and settled there, still ticking. On the back, now engraved in perfect, mechanical lettering, "The mirror is not for seeing. It's for remembering," and below it, scratched so faintly it was barely visible, "You're not alone anymore." By now, time inside the antique shop had lost all shape. Elias could no longer tell how long he had wandered the halls, how often he had slept, or if he ever truly woke. The watch in his hand ticked steadily, but the rhythm felt off. Not broken, just alien. Like it kept time for something other than him. And then one night, during what felt like an hour that had folded in on itself, Elias heard the unmistakable sound of waves. He followed the sound, walking through the corridor where the ceiling sagged like a tent, past stacks of broken globes and books that whispered in their bindings. He pushed open a door he didn't remember, a room he'd never seen, and found himself inside what appeared to be a mariner's study. The walls were hung with faded maps, not of countries or continents, but of oceans that didn't exist. The air smelled of brine and salt, despite no windows or access to the sea. And in the center of the room stood a clock. It was massive, its face nearly as tall as Elias himself. The wood was bleached like driftwood, weathered and smooth, with intricate carvings of waves, krakens, and drowned cities along its frame. Instead of hands, the center of the clock face contained a slowly turning compass rose. It didn't tick. It breathed, in and out, a faint, aquatic rhythm. Elias could feel the air shifting with it, damp and cold, like standing on the deck of a ship lost at sea. As he approached, the compass needle spun wildly, then stopped, pointing not north but downward. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath him grew soft, sagging underfoot like wet sand. And then, he was not in the shop anymore. He was underwater. Elias gasped but did not drown. He floated, suspended in an endless sea of shadow and light, surrounded by the muffled groans of creaking wood and the distant toll of underwater bells. Shapes drifted past, old-fashioned clocks, their faces blurred by barnacles and seaweed, their glass eyes cracked and leaking time into the deep. Above him, floating like a jellyfish with brass tentacles, was the clock from the mariner's room. Its pendulum was a ship's anchor, swinging slowly side to side in the dark water. Its voice filled his mind, not through sound, but through memory. I dreamed of tides where time forgets. I dreamed of hands that never return. I dreamed of you. Elias reached out and touched the pendulum as it swung close. The moment his fingers brushed the anchor, the sea began to rise. Not water, but moments. Scenes from his life, blurred, sun-drenched childhood summers, bitter winters where his father wept behind closed doors, the day he inherited the shop. All of it flooded around him. But they were wrong, slightly off, as if pulled from a version of his life that had played out in another timeline. One where choices diverged just enough to become unrecognizable. And then came the voice again, deep and ancient. You carry a lineage older than the ocean's first sigh. The clocks do not choose lightly. Elias was pulled downward, the water forming a vortex of spinning numbers and rusted gears. He saw the woman again, the one beneath the floorboards, floating beside him, her mouth opening to speak but releasing only bubbles shaped like symbols he couldn't decipher. He fell through layers of memory, through ticking heartbeats and shipwrecked dreams, until he landed hard, back in the mariner's study. The clock was still there, but it was broken now. Its face cracked, its compass rose spinning endlessly. A single seashell had been left at its base. Elias knelt, picked it up, and held it to his ear. Inside, he heard the voice whisper, "Every clock wants to return to the sea, and so will you." He turned the shell over in his hand, and found etched on its back the name of a ship, the Floorboard, and below it, departed, 1212 destination. Forgotten. The compass rose on the clock suddenly stopped spinning, and pointed back toward the attic. Time had circled again, and something or someone was calling him back to where the story first began. The attic welcomed Elias like a wound reopening. Dust danced in the narrow shaft of light from the single dormer window, and the air was dense, not with humidity, but with anticipation. The kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. That makes old floorboards groan even when no one's stepping on them. In the farthest corner of the attic sat the journal. It had not been there before. Bound in deep maroon leather, its edges rough and strangely damp, the journal seemed to breathe faintly, like it was still alive or had once been. It rested on a small pedestal made of gnarled driftwood, the kind you might find washed ashore after a storm, bearing symbols carved so faintly they almost vanished in the light. Elias approached slowly. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cover. It was warm, and then, with a sound like distant thunder, it opened itself. There were no pages. Instead, inside the cover was a single void, a swirling, dark well that seemed to stretch far beyond the dimensions of the book itself. It wasn't black like ink, but the kind of darkness that absorbs light, thought, memory. The kind of black that remembers you. And then it began to show him things, not through words, through visions. Each time he leaned closer, the surface shimmered, and a scene bloomed outward like a film projected onto the air. First, Elias, as a child, opening a drawer in the back of the shop and discovering a brass key shaped like an eye. He'd forgotten this completely, and yet, the moment flickered with total clarity. Second, a woman. Not the one beneath the floorboards, but someone else. Tall, robed, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that pulsed faintly with violet light. She stood in the back room of the shop, holding that same journal, whispering into its pages. Only the pages weren't there either. Third, the floorboards, but seen from beneath. A cavernous hollow space filled with shelves of broken clocks and jars of breathing shadows. There was a bed down there, and someone lying in it, motionless. Their chest didn't rise. Their eyes didn't close. But they were not dead. The vision trembled. A final image surfaced. A hand, aged and ink-stained, writing a name on the back cover of the journal. Elias. He reeled backward. The book slammed shut with a deep, pulsing thud, like the heartbeat of something enormous and dreaming. He grabbed the journal, half in panic, half in compulsion, and turned it over. The back was now filled with names. Hundreds of them. Some old and worn, others fresh and wet as if just written. The last one, Elias Thorne. His own. He hadn't written it. And beneath his name, space remained for one more word. But it hadn't formed yet. It was flickering, unfinished, like a cursor blinking at the end of a final sentence. He could feel it now. The shop was not merely a place. It was a memory trap, a maze of lives folded into one another, built on the backs of forgotten people and silent screams. And the journal was the heart of it. He tried to throw it down. It wouldn't leave his hand. No matter how hard he shook, no matter how far he flung, it clung to his palm like frostbite, familiar, suffocating. The journal was not waiting for him to write. It was waiting for the final chapter to finish itself. And the floorboards beneath his feet began to whisper again. Louder now, calling him. Elias descended from the attic, clutching the journal like a cursed limb. The shop had grown darker, yet the lights hadn't dimmed. It was the air itself that felt thicker, more opaque, as though the walls had begun to exhale memories. Every tick from the clocks now echoed longer, dragged out like the heartbeat of something sleeping beneath the building, something that had just started to stir. As he moved through the familiar corridors, Elias noticed a subtle shift. The furniture, once rigid, lifeless, coated in dust, had moved. Not drastically, just enough to be wrong. A table angled toward a different door. A mirror that now reflected a hallway that didn't exist. Chairs had gathered in a semicircle, as though they'd been watching something, someone. He turned to the large grandfather clock near the entrance, hoping for anchoring, something constant. It was gone. In its place stood a narrow wooden door that pulsed with warmth, like skin beneath fevered breath. He opened it. Behind the door was not a room, it was an entire replica of his childhood bedroom. The same crooked bookshelf, the same dent in the wall where he once threw a toy. Even the nightlight, shaped like a small crescent moon, still flickered gently in the corner. He stepped in. The moment he did, the door behind him vanished. The ceiling breathed. Elias sat down on the bed, the mattress sighing beneath him like it recognized his weight. He looked around, unsure whether this was a conjured memory or a perfect imitation. And then, on the pillow, he saw a small folded piece of paper. He opened it. Inside, in childlike handwriting, were the words, "Do not fall asleep here. It remembers too much." But it was too late. His eyelids had grown heavy, drugged by some invisible mist that hung in the corners of the room. The ticking of distant clocks softened, blurred, until it sounded like ocean waves crashing far away. He tried to rise, couldn't. The pillow began to whisper, not words, dreams. He felt them pour into him. Not his own, the dreams of others. Hundreds, thousands, people who had slept in this very room across time, space, stories. All pulled here like driftwood to a shore made of thought. One dream was of a girl who couldn't find her face in the mirror anymore. One was of a man who turned into a doorknob and waited centuries to be turned. One was of a house built entirely from forgotten birthdays, and when it rained, it only rained candles. The dreams passed through Elias like wind through a sieve, and then the house itself began to dream. He could feel it, deep under the floorboards, not just a presence but a consciousness. The wood pulsed with memory. The walls groaned with desire. It wanted to remember everything. It wanted to remember him. But Elias had secrets. Parts of himself even he had forgotten. And the house was hungry for those. Suddenly, a closet door creaked open across the room. Inside stood a mirror. He approached it slowly, the journal still fused to his hand like a brand. The mirror reflected not the bedroom behind him, but the shop as it once was, decades ago. Bright, clean, alive. And in the mirror, behind the counter, stood a man. His face obscured by shadow, but Elias knew him. His grandfather. The man raised a finger and pointed down. Elias followed the gesture to the floor beneath him. The floorboards were bleeding. Dark sap oozed up between the cracks, thick, sweet-smelling, like molasses or rot. It smelled like memories gone bad. Elias knelt, pressing his ear to the floor, and heard not whispers, but screams. Trapped dreams. Trapped people. And then, a final sound beneath it all. His own voice, younger, echoing from somewhere deep below, calling out, "Don't forget me." He jolted back, the bed now burning cold, the walls of the room peeling like fruit skin, revealing more rooms underneath, more versions of the same childhood space, layered like sediment. Each one slightly different, each one holding another piece of him. The house wasn't built of wood. It was built of Elias. And the dreams it remembered were only the beginning. Elias stood at the threshold of unraveling. The dreamlike room behind him had dissolved into a haze of memory and rot, and the shop above no longer felt like a place he could return to. The walls had begun pulsing with breath. The clocks ticked out of sync. Reality itself had started to fray. But he wasn't finished. The spiral had called him here. The whispers had welcomed him. And now something below, far below, waited. He stepped into the center of the crumbling bedroom, now stripped to bare floorboards. A hatch had formed. He hadn't seen it open, hadn't heard it creak. It was just there, as if it had always been waiting beneath the surface for him to remember it. There was no ladder, no staircase, just a hole descending into pure black. And from it the sound rose, not whispers, not clocks, a slow, wet breath, the breath of something that had no lungs, no tongue, no shape that could be named by light. Elias felt it in his bones, an ancient draw, like the pull of the ocean under moonlight. Not a trap, an invitation. He stepped into the dark. He didn't fall. He descended, as if the air had thickened to molasses, lowering him gently into a place far older than the shop, older than the city above, older than language. He landed on something soft. Not earth, not stone, flesh. The walls of the space were not walls. They pulsed. They were alive. Dim, bioluminescent veins spread across them, illuminating a vast hollow chamber that beat with an organic rhythm. The smell was not decay. It was the scent of remembered things, the dust of old toys, the perfume of a forgotten lover, the copper tang of blood from a childhood fall. All of it, all at once. He walked forward, though the ground moved beneath him, shifting gently, adjusting to his presence, carrying him toward the center. And then he saw it. The mouth. Not a mouth like a creature's. Not lips and teeth and tongue. It was a void torn into the world's foundation itself. A wound that had never healed, never closed, only learned how to speak. It breathed stories. It exhaled centuries. Its edges quivered with memory, coated in the shadows of everything that had ever been forgotten. Elias knelt before it. He didn't know why. He only knew it was what the spiral had wanted. The mouth knew him, and it began to speak, not in words but in experiences. Flooding his mind, Elias saw every moment he had forgotten, the nightmares he had buried, the things that had watched him from under his bed as a child. The day he visited the shop as a boy, touched the cursed clock, and left with something attached to his soul. He had never just inherited the store. He had been chosen by it. And now the mouth wanted its final offering. It asked him, not in voice but in pressure, will you remain? Because someone always had to stay. Someone had to remember for the house. Someone had to listen for the voices that could not sleep. Someone had to feed the mouth with memory, pain, and silence. The watch on Elias's wrist began ticking again. Slowly, deliberately, he looked up into the void. And he answered, yes. The mouth opened wider. The chamber pulsed once more. And Elias stepped forward, into the dark, into the breath, into the forever. The mouth closed, not with a slam, not with a finality, but with a slow, aching breath inward, as if the world had inhaled Elias and now simply refused to exhale. Silence reigned for a long time. The walls of the chamber stopped pulsing. The faint glow in the veins of the living foundation dimmed until only a hint of their outline remained, like blood cooling beneath translucent skin. It was not darkness. It was emptiness. Then, like a dying echo, the spiral began again. Not physically, not on the walls or in the space around it, but deep within the memory of the place. It wound not on paper or wood or floorboards, but in the air itself, in the fabric of time wrapped tightly around the bones of the shop. Upstairs, the trapdoor in the floor quietly resealed itself, nodding together as if it had always been part of the room's design. The clocks stopped ticking. The shadows pulled themselves back into their corners. The dust settled. The world exhaled, and the door to the shop opened. A bell chimed gently, The first sound in hours. Or was it years? Time no longer followed human rules. A child stepped into the shop, barely older than 7. Small, wide-eyed, holding a letter in trembling hands. The envelope bore no name, only the imprint of a spiral, faintly glowing silver against black parchment. Behind the counter now stood a man. You might have thought it was Elias if you squinted, if you didn't look too closely, if you didn't listen to the way he breathed, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, like he was keeping time not with lungs, but with the heartbeat of the house. The man smiled, not warmly, not coldly, just enough. "Welcome," he said softly, his voice like the creak of an old rocking chair. "We've been waiting." The child stepped forward. Below their feet the floor groaned. The spiral turned once more, and somewhere far beneath the shop, beneath the foundation, beneath the memory, beneath everything, something ancient, something endless, sighed with contentment. The mouth had fed, and the cycle would begin again. It always did, and always will.